Yeah, in July and August.
That's what it is. A nice hot, good summer where the grapes can grow. And that's true, you have a lot of fruit along the lake.
Yeah,
and a nice cold summer, cold winter.
Yeah.
That's probably also from the lake, because of the thermal mass of the water. Once it's hot, it keeps the heat, and once it's cold, it keeps the cool.
Right, yeah, that's right, yeah. We've got in geography, we got That's it. Okay. If you want to hold it when you're talking, you can. I'll ask a question first. Could you tell us a little bit about eurythmy in general and where it all began?
Yes, eurythmy came as an impulse to bring the spoken word into movement in space through the use of the human body. It's a movement impulse, and if the larynx, if the sound, let's say ah or g, which live in all cultures, those sounds, all the sounds that we use in speech, they live in all the cultures. They vary from culture to culture, depending on the folk soul. But those sounds live, and they're alive. Where are they alive? They're alive in the ground. They're alive in the sky, inside the soul of the people. And, if the sound ah begins to arise in the larynx, and the larynx doesn't sound it, but instead the body, the physical form, sounds it in space silently in movement, that's a kind of an expression of what eurythmy is.
Could we get into? Could we get into the idea or the specific art form of speech eurythmy, and how that differs maybe from the other kinds of eurythmy?
Well, the two forms of eurythmy are the tone eurythmy, which is, again, in a similar way, like an E sharp or an F or a chord, or the intervals can be made visible in space in the same way. The speech eurythmy has to do with, specifically, bringing a poem to life, or bringing speech. But usually you want it to be strong speech that has power and intensity, or humor, or and the intense nature of poetry makes it ideal for performing eurythmy to it, because of there's a lot said in a short amount of space, and the speech that's used for the eurythmy, it's different than, let's say, when I would give a poetry reading of my own poetry. You noticed how the speech differed. There's a real, I'm speaking to you out of my soul and my feelings, and I might have a lyric quality more because I'm connected with what I'm writing. I might go into a kind of epic mode or a dramatic mode depending on my poetry, but still, being the writer, I'm too connected with what I write to get too far from the lyric, also being young and fundamentally romantic poet. Although, modern. But in the speech eurythmy, what you're trying to do is make the sounds really alive, and really find the consonants, and really let the sound live out into space, and almost become visible, because the eurythmists are only moving what I make visible, audibly visible. And so if I were to say, fire, they can make that visible, but if I just say fire, there's nothing for them to do. They're expressing what I speak, see? So it's very important that there's a real connection. And then the spaces between the words is where, language is alive. And every different language, the differences in it have to do a lot with that differing quality of the spaces in between words. Like the Germanic languages are much more formed and sculptural in the words themselves. English is much more alive in the space between words, in the unspoken, and often there's movement in those spaces in between. That's sort of like the soul space of language. So there's a whole speech art form. It's a 4-year study, in the same way that the eurythmy is a 4-year study of this art of speech formation, it's called. We do a lot of drama and Greek gymnastics, throwing the javelin, throwing the discus, much as the early Greeks used those athletic forms to train their actors in proper speech formation. And so you study, you try and find a way to bring out the spiritual qualities in the sounds of the words. What's alive still in the words. The content of words is very slowly atrophying and dying in our culture. The meaning, the sort of intellectual content. But what still has a kind of link with the great forces of life is the sound of language. That still is pure and primal in its connectedness to the cosmos. And so you're trying to find that connectedness, because that's what eurythmy is also trying to do. Reconnect and heal, and bring art into a new place,
Okay, with regards to speech eurythmy, how do you go about interpreting a poem for presentation? Is it a collaborative effort between you and the dancer? And could you talk about things such as your tone and the timing and the colors and the fabric of the costume, as well as the choreography of the dancer?
Yeah, the pieces, vary according to what kinds of pieces they are and what is being expressed in them. Let's say, like, Barbara moved to one of my poems, the canoeing poem. There I have a very strong impulse in terms of what I feel is happening in that poem, and we have to come to sort of an agreement about how it should be sounding in space. And then I leave it up to her, when she hears what I'm trying to, the kind of music that I want to live in the language, I leave it up to her how to express it in space, because that's her art form. Many of the pieces have forms that have been created by Rudolf Steiner or other eurythmists. But it does, one thing I would say, it takes a long, long time to penetrate a poem, to penetrate a line. It takes, months and months for each piece to work on it and work up the form. The choreography is often very complex, and each sound is penetrated. She knows each sound, each consonant, each vowel, each diphthong, each interval, where I let it fall off, where I sound the consonant. And in other poems, like if I come to this tour, Christina might tell me, this is how I want this to sound, She specifically has in her mind, her consciousness, what she wants expressed, what she wants to express in a poem, and I listen to that and try and make that sound in space, and we work on it until she says, no, that's too hard, that's too more disembodied, I want this character, or and we work on it together until we come to what each of us feels should be sounding in the piece, you see. But it takes them a long, long time, because they know every g, every owl, every t, where it happens in the space in between. It's incredibly revelatory for a writer. That's why we're planning to tour universities and English departments and have the people in the English departments actually move, do workshops in eurythmy and actually move the language in space, because it's like revelatory how rich a single sentence is, a single word, the sounds, and how each sound is so connected to the whole cosmos. It really enlivens language. It did for me, and that's what I find is so exciting about it.
In the program today, you presented 2 poems by Carl Sandburg, and I'm wondering if the work of certain poets, more than others, lends itself to eurythmic interpretation.
Yeah, well, that's a good question. It's very much the case. More cerebral poets are more difficult, that live in the concepts. It's like I said before, what eurythmy can express is the sounding quality of language, and the sort of more abstract, cerebral, contextual quality of language is more difficult to express in movement. You do to some extent, all poems do, but the poetry that has some very good, strong, pure sounds and modulations of sound are easily expressed. I mean, and it just depends on the poem by the poet, A cerebral poet like T.S. Eliot has many, many incredibly musical pieces, and we've done quite a few of those. Or Wallace Stevens, an incredibly sophisticated, poet, has very many beautiful poems that have a real musical sounding. It just depends on the poem, really, more than the poet, and a kind of poetry that can be visibly expressed, you see.
Okay, you've written poetry to be read and heard, and also poetry that's meant for eurythmy performance. Now, when you sit down to write a poem, do you consciously think about how you want that poem to be presented, and also, is there a different creative process involved in each case?
Yeah, there's a different creative process. It's called life and living, and what makes poetry arise in one, and everyone has a different mode of creating. For me, it's like I feel like I just get this feeling. I feel like I'm going to give birth, or I just sit down. I don't know what exactly or why, and write. Or something happens, and it sits in me maybe a little while, a day, maybe months, maybe a year, and then I just sit down and I write. A few times I have. Only a few times have I consciously, in writing, thought of it being for eurythmy and movement and space, as I have gotten involved in it, But it depends. Like years and years ago, I was asked by a friend of mine who was a ballet dancer, a ballerina, to write a piece for ballet, a long, long piece, many-part poem that she would choreograph about jealousy, and that was her theme. And I wrote this long thing, and that Zodiac Dance Company in Buffalo performed. We performed it all over. It was very successful. That was, before I knew anything about eurythmy. And then I toured with Barbara for a while, and she would move to my poetry. We still didn't know anything about eurythmy. So it was all kind of precursing of a really more conscious combination collaboration. But generally I write poetry for, like the one she did that I wrote about off North Point at night, about being on the water, was just like in response to this incredible, powerful experience out on the water at night. But now I will be doing more and more collaborative work, and I will think about, how it sounds, simply because that's what, life is asking of me. Or many times, as I mentioned in the program, a lot of the pieces come from writing workshops I've done, where I'm trying to explain something to the children, the high school children or the young children, and I'll just start to write something, and then some of my best things will come from that. Or a friend will die, and people will have plant a tree and want me to sort of write something to sort of unite the community, and I'll write something out of that moment. And so there's all sorts of different circumstances that bring on a poem, you see.
Who first introduced you to eurythmy, and can you tell us a little bit about that and your involvement in the Waldorf School and that kind of thing?
I had chased Barbara over to Europe and blew a lot of really great readings in the States thereby, and she was going to university in Freiburg, in France, German, Swiss border there. And I used to play on the streets, play mandolin, penny whistle, flutes, banjos, do street theater every day while she went to university, and it was very exciting. I met all kinds of people from all over the world, and some days I'd make $100, some days enough for a cup of tea. And while we were there, she brought me to this strange school where everything seemed so beautiful and well-made, and everybody seemed so, like, conscious. And we saw this eurythmy performance, and there was a speech chorus of, like, about 20 people speaking at once, this poem, and it really blew me away. And then came back to the States, and Barbara came back afterwards, and she was doing dance in New York City, jazz dance and modern, and it's very, very sort of competitive and sort of harsh, sort of a kind of spiritual dead end in some ways, in terms of the movement and where it was going. And when she was looking for something, she's very gifted movement-wise, and we found out about this community where there was a school, eurythmy training, so we went there. And I had a hard time with it at first. Ran an art museum, and through an arts grant, and did stained glass work with a very fine studio and restored stained glass windows all over the country. But still had a hard time penetrating into the whole philosophy. But she was, from the first moment, a born eurythmist, like a kind of 40 lifetimes of destiny, clicked, and immediately. And but then through the drama work I did there, I did a lot of drama, a lot of acting and plays, not intellectually in any way, but through the artistic work, I found my way into the whole speech work, drama work, and the philosophy, only as picture alive in space. That's the way any philosophy works for me, or doesn't it? If it's a picture that resonates in a good way inside me, then I'll let it resonate and listen to it. I mean, it's not law, it's not fixed. It's just a picture that feels right,
At the start of the performance, you read a few non-eurythmy poems of your own, and you introduced each one with a gentle piece on the recorder. As a poet, what relationship do you perceive between words and music?
Yeah. Well, there's a deep relationship. The relationship between you and me, human being to human being, or me and the pine tree out there. There's a certain. It depends on what kind of relationship you make. What kind of a sort of a warmth you bring and a connectedness you bring. You can read philosophers' aesthetics, and Hegel will have this whole sort of scale of where music is, the differences between music, between language. Steiner as well has this sort of like hierarchical sort of picture of the different art forms, not hierarchical, but just their different roles in the human soul and the human organism, etc., what they speak to, and human evolution, etc. And I've studied all that and appreciate it. But being a sort of not so intellectual, more of a warmth person, I try and find the bridges between things. That's why I'm very active in combining the visual, which was my first training. My training was actually doing these huge oil paintings in the 60s up down in Buffalo here at the university, and then slowly started to put text in the paintings, write words into the paintings, and then give readings of my paintings, And then I started combining and getting into printing and etching and dry point, and then started combining words with the graphics, and that's when I got this little grant to do that book, and Listen Friend, and so I see a great relationship. I like this to the collaborative endeavors, and in the same way, movement in the word, I think, and also music and language, have a very, very strong connection. Though I do know that language, it requires, or speech requires much more work on the part of an audience. It has more to do with the ego, more to do with the ego, the I am of the person hearing it, and they really have to be present in themselves. Whereas, although in my poetry I do try and bring a lot of musical qualities, so that more sleeping part, that more unconscious part, can resonate and be alive in the poetry, but still in language is a more wakeful quality than in music sometimes, where the great subconscious can be, really healed and nurtured and carried or shocked or whatever. It's much more easily entered into. But they're just different, things. But I feel there's a strong relationship, of course.
So, would the use of the recorder at the beginning of those poems be a way of easing the audience into your poem and sort of surrendering that ego?
Yeah, just a sort of, well, it's just, when you give a performance to people, they don't know you, there they sit, and it's just a way of touching them on the shoulder. It's just a way of creating a space that's got some love flowing in it, some, I don't mean gushy love, but I mean that sort of a sort of pure, sort of shining humanity, and just a warmth, and it just to soften the sort of tension that most people live in,
as a member of the audience, I can say it really worked. It really was nice. And I'm wondering if the recorder is, as an instrument, is better suited for that than other types of instruments. Do you think so? Or
I don't know. Sometimes I do it with singing, sometimes with the guitar or mandolin. It depends. I just happen to play the recorder more. It depends on the mood you're trying to create. Like you heard, the violinist and the piano together. I mean, that's a quite different type of mood. But for me, it comes out of a kind of a deeper, that sort of out there. It comes from a deep sort of warmth place. That particular sound, and the wood, the sounding of the wood. It just goes with the things I would write.
While we're on the subject of the relationship of words to music, I'm wondering if we might conclude with a short reading.
Sure. This is a poem called Chicory, about this wild dog that I lived with in the backwoods for many years. And this is he attacked me in the woods, and this is a poem about how I found him. Flowering, hawthorn-thicketed field in spring, when the young milkweed, moist, unwrinkled, Dennis and Henry and grandfather's foraging ghost and I were gathering chicory roots. And I, lagging, dreamy, listening, heard behind me the rustle of rabbits or robins. And there through the pale snapweed and bonny bent clover, I, startling, turning, staring, followed the muscly, mouthy workings of a hard-headed, hungry, fight-fired Labrador who came keenly, brutally, fangs reared and running fast on towards me. And my back unwound, and my life rose up, and I overpowered him in the fronds and waking flowers. He was no match, even then, and now would never tempt my hardwood arms, but he followed me spirited all that day in some wild heathen respect or awe. And he grew so swiftly fond of me, and fond of my ways, and at each panicle I paused to praise, he paused, just as tender, to piss or paw or ponder with his teeth. And I grew to love his sky-fletched fleeting onward gaze and his powerful strides, high-hearted through the pheasant's dreams, through the boar-breasted fields with seeds on his nose. He wandered so smoky, browny, black, burnt hickory in the settling, tufted, fiery, seedling-scented sun, and I called him Chicory, like the roasted, muddy roots of the ground. It was his broad, brackish, sweet-clouded spring, and I dared not ever leave him.
Mike Finn, thank you very much.
My pleasure.
Seems to be recording at the moment. Let's see if it really is. My guest today has been Julia Child, and we've been talking about your child's health. Thank you very much for joining us. Good afternoon.